Good evening. Welcome to Holotropic Breathwork, Non-Ordinary States of Consciousness, and why it is finally attracting so much attention. Our speaker this evening, the Reverend Dr. Lynn, has been facilitating breathwork since the 1980s to help others resolve trauma and find healing. In addition to studying directly with the developer of Holotropic Breathwork, Dr. Stanislav Grof, she is also an advanced certified in Rolf structural integration, having trained directly with Dr. Ida Rolf, is an ordained minister, medical Qigong master, and certified light therapist. She holds a doctorate in religious studies, teaches science of mind, a course in miracles, and total brain health for seniors. Dr. Lynn sees private clients in her practice, Spirit of Wholeness in Glenwood Springs. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lynn.
Well, so nice to see everybody come out tonight. I feel like I'm in my home pod, finally. I came here from Glenwood Springs, and gratitude for the weather holding. I have some questions. This is a broad topic, and I'm sure people are coming from different points of view, things that they want to learn. There'll be a lot of questions from you for me, but I want to know a little bit more about who's in the audience. So might I ask, who are healthcare professionals that are here, like with kind of academic interest in order to learn more about how to treat your patients? Okay, good. On the other side of the spectrum, who has been an experimenter in non-ordinary states of consciousness, let's just say doing field research on your own for a little while or a long while? Okay, we're going to call you psychonauts. Anybody here old enough to grow up in the 60s or 70s and knew about Tim Leary and Ram Dass and those kind of characters? Okay, so some of our history goes back that far. Anybody here just to expand your spiritual understanding or grow spiritually? Couple. Anybody have children that are experimenting with drugs that you don't know kind of how to understand what they're looking for or how to deal with them? Okay. Anybody interested particularly in Stan Grof and his work and where he's taking his research in terms of the future of psychiatry? Okay, we'll deal with that a little bit. Anybody just interested in non-ordinary states of consciousness in general? We're going to focus on holotropic breathwork, but it's a broad area. Okay, good. And then who has done other kinds of breath work and maybe are interested in what this holotropic business is about? Excellent. Okay. That gives me a good idea of how to organize my work. We have 60 minutes, and Stan Grof has been doing this for 60 years. I've been doing it for 30. And I want to say that everything that's in this presentation, I didn't make it up. This comes from Stan Grof's research. We're talking about 400 case studies of documented LSD, psychotherapy, and holotropic breathwork. And this is being done internationally now. Myself, I've probably done a couple hundred sessions over 30 years. So most of what I talk about are things that I've personally experienced. Not everything. If it comes to like research, I don't follow all the current research in here, but I put a little bit in just for interest's sake. So these are pictures of Stan Grof, Stanislav. He was Czechoslovakian born, and his wife Christina, who helped him to create the holotropic breathwork model. They were at Esalen at the time that this all developed. So there's so much to say about Stan, but he was a classically trained Freudian psychiatrist in Prague, Czechoslovakia, at the time that Sandoz Labs and Albert Hofmann discovered lysergic acid And what they were doing then was trying to get clinicians to experiment with this substance, which was put people into non-ordinary states in order to have a better idea of what people were going through that were psychotic, neurotic or psychotic, or just that they couldn't understand what that was about. So Stan volunteered to be a research study himself, and in addition to taking LSD, they put strobe lights on him, and he catapulted out of his body and had an extraordinary experience of merging with the whole cosmos and also not knowing who he was. So this is an extraordinary experience for somebody who's classically trained in Freudian psychiatry. And as a result of that experience, it changed his paradigm or his worldview forever. And he realized the limitations of what Freudian psychology was doing. And basically, if any of you have studied that, the model was that children are born with what they call a tabula rasa, which means a blank slate. Freud thought that the patterning of who the person is going to be started with birth, and nothing happened before. And even the brain researchers were saying, yes, the brain's not myelinated at birth. You can't possibly have memory of anything that happened before birth. So Stan Grof continued studying people who were under the influence of LSD psychotherapy, and documented 3,000 case studies while he was in Prague before the Russians came and took over. And he was fortunate to get a scholarship at Maryland Psychiatric Hospital. So he came to the US with basically the clothes on his back and a satchel with 3,000 case studies of LSD psychotherapy. And he started his research here. And that progressed until the time that LSD hit the streets. People were having bad trips. Timothy Leary wasn't being very responsible about how he was introducing this to the public. They didn't have good sets and settings. They didn't really know what was possible. And some bad things happen. So the government made it a controlled substance, and at that time, the studies stopped. So that was about the mid-70s, I believe. I've got this documented someplace, but so as serendipity would have it, Michael Murphy, who was one of the founders of Esalen Institute in Big Sur, was at a party in Connecticut, and Grof was there. And Murphy invited Grof to Esalen because they were just pioneering some research in the human growth potential movement. Anybody been to Esalen in Big Sur? Yeah, I lived in that area before I came here 7 years ago. At any rate, Stan was 47, and he was the perfect person to really kick off this whole exploration in the human growth potential movement. He wanted to continue working with non-ordinary states, but he couldn't use the LSD. So he and Christina developed a way for people to enter into non-ordinary states without having to ingest any substances, which made it safe and legal. So Megan asked me, why is this finally getting attention? Well, it has had attention for the duration. It's just that there seems to be a resurgence of interest recently because in Colorado, as well as Oregon, as you know, they have made certain psychoactive substances basically legal to use therapeutically. So that's sort of opened a door, and more people who maybe have been in the background of being interested in that, people like me that were just sort of quiet about it, are now having permission to open up and say, well, I'm interested in that, or I would like to try that, or maybe I would even like to be, trained to be a facilitator, something like that. So The reason it's finally getting more attention is because things are opening up. And there's another point of view that I have that I'll share with you. So this is, I don't know how that is, pretty fuzzy up there. Anybody recognize Alex Gray, visionary artist? Not so much. So he paints a lot of things that are non-ordinary states of consciousness, and this is a picture of Stan with his third eye open with all these little fetuses around him. So we're going to get to, why fetuses. So let's just go back to the beginning. Non-ordinary state of consciousness. That's a broad field, and it can be induced in a lot of ways. Stan's wife, Christina, went through a Kundalini awakening because from her third childbirth. So, she had been studying with Muktananda, meditation, and something about, that opening put her into a Kundalini awakening process, which put her into Esalen, studying with Grof, where she stayed for a year and ultimately ended up marrying him. But I'm saying that non-ordinary states can be induced by any number of things. Anybody had a near-death experience? Okay. That also is becoming a little bit more open to talk about. It used to be that if somebody had that kind of experience, they were afraid to say anything because people might think you were crazy or just not believe you, which is re-traumatizing. So people nearing death often will go into a non-ordinary state. Anybody been with somebody who was dying and they kind of float off into other places, or maybe talk about seeing things or knowing things or wanting to go places? That's a non-ordinary state. Anybody does deep meditation, that you're able to transcend the boundaries of your body in this time space and go places and know things. So a non-ordinary state is really anything that takes you out of the limitations of, I am this body at this time in this room, just circumscribed by all of your identifications, these roles. Anything that takes you beyond space, beyond time, beyond normal identity, you could call non-ordinary state. Obviously, taking psychedelics puts you into a non-ordinary state. Problem with psychedelics is that if it's just ingested like socially, without a context, without supervision, without understanding what to expect, the things that can open up in the psyche can be, let's just say, disorienting. And if someone isn't pretty psychologically stable, mentally relatively healthy, a situation like that could catapult them into something worse. So in current psychedelic research, there's a big emphasis on the importance of safety and what's called set and setting. So what I'm giving you tonight is more or less a set. The setup is the context in which things can happen so that you have some awareness of what to expect, so that if it comes upon you, it's like, oh, right, the facilitator talked about maybe that could happen. The setting could be something like this: a place that is safe, that's clean, that nobody's going to disturb you, that has just everything to be a container, so that you would feel safe to just let go and almost let yourself be born again with a facilitator. So I'm going to really emphasize this, that experimenting with drugs on your own or in a social setting without a good setting and without a context can be disorienting to the point that it's counterproductive. That's part of the problem with this. That's part of why there's so much focus right now on training good psychedelic, I'm going to say sitter or facilitators, therapists, okay? So, anybody done any shamanic work? Gone to, South America, ingested ayahuasca, any of those kind of things? Okay, not so much. Some people have been doing that. They feel like they've got to go to another place and, have an indigenous healer to guide them through. That's perfectly fine. The thing about the holotropic breathwork is that it can be done right here, close to home. There's a few of us certified facilitators, not too many in the Grof tradition, but they're available. And these states of mind can be experimented with or experienced in a safe setting. It really is safe because you're not taking any chemicals. Everything is done with your breath and music. What Grof found when he was, we'll talk about. What Stan Grof found when he was doing his research was that when people went into these non-ordinary states, they regressed, and often, very often, they would report things that seemed like birth. So he started taking this seriously and came to the conclusion that most of what ends up as neurosis or psychosis really can be traced back to something about the trauma that we go through in the process of birth. So what unites us all in consciousness here is that we all went there. Every person who's sitting here has successfully navigated the trauma of being born into a physical body. Some not so long ago, some of us a long time ago. But most of us don't remember that. Mostly it's just like put into the subconscious. So I believe that part of why this is attracting attention now, number one, some of us are getting older. Some of us are looking down the pike about, well, what happens next? Is this all there is? Some people are young and they're finding things are not so satisfying in the material world or the world of technology or whatever that might be. And they're looking for some other aspect. So the exploration of, what's deeper, what's beyond this is, I find it very interesting. I've been an inner pioneer forever. When we don't get good spiritual education, and when our ego takes over and makes us feel like we're separate from everybody else or different or weird or judged, it's a really nice thing to come back home and find out that you're actually one with all of these other people, even the natural kingdom, even with spirit. So doing inner explorations is a way to get back to the innermost part of yourself and also expand beyond the limitations of what you thought was yourself and to explore that there's so much more in the cosmos to know about. I think I'm going to skip this. So we're going to go into right now what's the basis for holotropic breathwork. There's some really good research, and Stan Grof is an incredible genius in terms of putting together systems. So this work that he did in non-ordinary states, taking all of his notes, he's a scientist, right? He's a researcher. So he came up with what he calls a cartography. It's a map of the psyche of what happens during conception, gestation, and delivery. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about has to do with birth, all right? Because, as I said, he felt that most of our psychological issues can be traced back to something that happened or didn't happen correctly at birth, not the least of which is just getting forced through a small birth canal and having our heads crushed. So in the holotropic breathwork, we're open to things changing. Homeostasis is everything is the same as it always has been. No change. When we want to expand our consciousness, we're opening ourselves to something different. But that ego part of us that wants to keep us safe and like that's too weird and you better not go there, can give us resistance. Like, okay, I'm not going to do that. So part of us wants to reach out and be more. Part of us doesn't want to. So what we say, or what Stan says, is that in order to change anything, first of all, you can't just resist and hate it. You have to be with it and accept it as it is. And from that place, then things can start to open and change. So this last phrase in here is really quite brilliant. It has to do with emotional expression. Now, I don't know about all of you, but when I was young, expressing yourself emotionally was not very sanctioned. I was raised in the era of nice girls don't talk that way, and girls should be seen and not heard. So, or stop that crying, or I'm going to give you something to cry about. Ever heard any of that? So in the breath work, we give people the permission to express whatever might come up. That's what makes it safe. We set up a setting, we give the background of what could happen, and then we give full permission. Lying on the floor, on the back, on a pad, with a facilitator, watching the room, and a sitter. Somebody sits with you. So these are done in dyads. You're not alone in this. There's somebody, like a spiritual midwife, watching over you. One of the important guidelines that we have is that every one of us has an inner healer. So you could call it your higher self. You could call it your autonomic nervous system. You could call it spirit guidance, whatever. But there's something in you that knows how to heal. We've all had injuries, right? Or we've all gotten sick. And so there's some natural mechanism that's built into us, our bodies and our minds, that guides us to what is going to help me heal from the inside out, or get resources from the outside and bring it in. So the inner healer is really the therapist when it comes to breath work. As a facilitator or a sitter, we do not put ourselves in a position of being a therapist to analyze what's going on with you, and to figure it out, or to guide you, or to tell you what to do, or to interpret your experience afterwards. We really set up a context where your inner healer knows exactly the right and the best thing to bring to you at this time according to what your needs are. And we deeply honor that. This last phrase here, in order to make it safe for somebody to lay down on a floor on a mat, for 3 hours of breathing and explore their inner dimensions, we have to make people feel protected, right? So the protection, as I said, is putting things in a safe setting. All of the facilitators, the Grof facilitators, are very well trained, and I've got scads of experience. So you can relax and feel safe. You're protected. I've seen just about everything that can happen. Maybe not everything, but I've seen more than anybody really wants to know about, of the things that can come up with people, when they're undergoing reliving of trauma or stress, or going through healing crises. As my introduction said, the holotropic breathwork, that's a lot of emotional work. Medical qigong is energy work, so I work in that way. Rolfing, I've been doing 45 years, so I've seen all kinds of things going on with people physically. And there's another system that I didn't talk about. So I personally have a huge, vast container for people's experiences without judgment. So the permission is whatever comes up, express it and express it more. Like, let's get this out of you. If you've been holding on to this for your whole life, let's get it up and out here and now. So if you need to scream, if you need to kick, if you need to fight, if you need to cry, if you need to curl up in a field, whatever you need to do in order to express what's arising in you, we give full permission for that kind of expression. And hardly any place else in our world, I think you would agree, do you have the permission to act out what you're feeling inside, right? Not at your jobs, not while you're driving your car. So permission, and then the connection, feeling like you're connected with the sitter that's with you, the facilitator. There's a connection happening with your own inner self, and sometimes in a transpersonal experience, you feel connected with the whole universe. So it's a very healing thing. So I'm just going to talk about these last things. How do we make protection? If somebody comes in for a day-long workshop, they may feel like, oh, this is too much, or I'm done, or I'm out of here, or I need to be in nature. I had somebody walk out that needed to be in nature and didn't come back for the afternoon session and left her sitter there, or her breather, without any sitter. We don't do that. So if you come into a breathwork setting, you agree that regardless of what you may experience, regardless of how tired you might be, you're going to stay here for the whole thing, which includes an integration session after the breath work. Sometimes when we're moving big energies through, sexuality will come up. It's base chakra. We all have it. So the agreement is that you express whatever you want to on the floor, or just yell or whatever, but don't act out sexual energy with your partner or somebody else in the group, right? And then things can get aggressive sometimes. So absolutely, you may not hurt yourself, and you can't hit me. If things get too wild, we might just take a blanket and wrap you up and contain that energy. And then obviously, with any work that you're doing therapeutically, you don't want to have confidentiality broken, because the things that happen during a breathwork session are so deeply, intimately personal that you don't want people taking your story and spreading it around to other people. So it takes a certain amount of maturity, to approach this in the first place, to be willing to go through that kind of an inner exploration and to be there for somebody else doing the same thing, and to hold a container for how big this can be, because it can be really big. The breathing. I haven't talked too much about the breathing, but it's breath work. So what is breath? The term inspiration means spirit in, and it's the first thing that happens. The first thing that happens when the fetus leaves the mother and the umbilical cord is cut and the blood supply in the air is not being provided by the blood from the mother, and all of a sudden, the baby takes its first breath, and we call it inspiration, and it means spirit in. So the spirit of life comes and animates that child at that time. And from that time on, the autonomic portions of our brain keep us breathing more or less through our whole lifetime until our last breath, which is called what? What do they put on the death certificate? Expiration. Expiration. That's spirit out. So the breath is supremely important, because that is the animating force, is the prana or the chi that comes from the environment, that comes through us, that gives us the life force energy that circulates through our system, through all the cells, regenerates the cells, and also brings consciousness. So when we work with breathing deeper and faster, what we're doing is we're really bringing a whole bunch of spirit, into blowing open the circuits that have stayed kind of deadened or limited, right? So when you breathe faster and deeper, and this work can go on for 3 hours, we allow 3 hours for a session. The way that we get it started is with music. We play evocative music, faster and deeper, kind of rhythmic, drumming, shamanic music, which a lot of times gets the physical body moving, and it kind of like breaks out, stasis and patterns of holding. So if you were to breathe faster and deeper for 20, 30, 40 minutes, it's very unlikely that you wouldn't have some kind of change of brain chemistry that would put you into a different state of consciousness. And that's what we do. That's really the simplicity of it. No drugs, lie on the floor, give your inner healer permission, to come through and give you an experience. Trust the person that's sitting with you. We put on the music pretty loud so it vibrates your cells, and you start breathing. And if you want to keep up with the music, it might be okay? So we're really using the breath. It's the breath that carries the energy through this. If you want to stay there and just go, for 3 hours, you might wonder, well, why didn't anything happen? That person had all these experiences. Well, I didn't see anything. Well, you didn't breathe. So the facilitator or the sitter might do some kind of gentle nudgings like, breathe, breathe. So if you've breathed faster and deeper for 40 minutes, and it's pretty obvious that you're having some other kind of experience, we don't need to keep you breathing like that, because you're in that state of the brain chemistry change that is the non-ordinary state. So the music will carry the experience through different, I'm going to say sine waves. The first maybe 40 minutes of music can be evocative in order to really shake you out of your ordinary static environment. The next 40 minutes is likely to be adventurous. So the music, it's nonverbal, and there can be cultural music, but the music is a really big part of the holotropic system because it's particularly put together and orchestrated in a way to suggest to your psyche that you're going to go on some grand adventure. And every person that's lying in the room is going to have a different experience. Some people might be, back in something of their childhood or their experiences. This is what a room might look like. Usually, this must have been a pretty crowded room because we like to have more space around people so that they're free to move around. But you need to stay on your own space and not kick anybody else. So it might look like nothing's happening, but inside, all kinds of wonderful, creative, marvelous, unusual things can be happening. So the connection, the spirit connects the mind and the body and the emotions and the spirit all together. The breath can connect you with forces of nature. The breath can take you right back to spirit. The breath can take you deep inside the cells of your body. And you can even work out some of your interpersonal connections non-locally. I've worked out a lot of relationship stuff just lying on the floor. So I think, at least to me, it seems like we could all use more connection with each other. Is that right? We get kind of feeling disconnected sometimes, kind of lonely. So I talked about that there is, in the breathwork system, that you have one person assigned to be a sitter. And it's kind of like being a spiritual midwife. Bring your futon or your thing, your job is just to hold space for that person. To create a container where anything that happens, you don't let anything happen to your person. And anything that they need, if they need water or Kleenex or they need to get up and use the bathroom, you lead them. It's like taking care of a small baby, because the person is in a regressed state. And we want to keep them kind of like with eyes closed or an eye mask on, to stay in that interior state and not, come out and look around. So the sitter is there to unconditionally protect you and keep you safe. And it's a really blessed thing to sit for somebody who's going through that kind of deep interpersonal work. So here's the cartography. Here's the map. What can happen if you sign up for a breath workshop? Anything in your entire biography could occur. Typically, in a first session, what your psyche is going to serve up to you is something that just happened, like on my drive in here, somebody cut me off and I'm so, and then it's like, okay, all right, enough of that. And then it'll go, well, like, when did something like that happen before? When did you feel cut off and, ignore, so it can go through a series of events that have been disturbing or that are bothering you, kind of like on the surface. And for me, it's sort of like chapters in a book. It's like, okay, are you done with the neighbor now? Are you done with, the ex-boyfriend? Let's go to something a little bit deeper. So anything in your whole biographical history, and some of us have more history than others, anything could come up. And a lot of times it takes a session or two just working through your personal biography, depending on what kind of a life that you've had. Some of us have had a really tough life with a lot of events or injuries or accidents or traumas or illnesses that we need to work through. And the breathwork map is a really beautiful way to get the understanding of that, to relive it, to transcend it, to transform it. And it's like, okay, we're done with that. We don't need to keep cycling through that again, because I got it, right? After you've gone through your biographical material, and this is not necessarily chronological, these are just possible things that can happen. The next level that we're very interested in is called the perinatal level. Perinatal is Grof's term that he coined for around birth. It's anything surrounding the birth experience. So, as I mentioned, in the LSD psychotherapy, he's got well-documented cases of people remembering and even, documenting things that happened to them in their actual birth, but just before, and all the way to conception, and even before. But that's perinatal. Anything from the time you were conceived to the time that you were born, including, if there were bright lights or forceps or umbilical cords or how you were received when you were born. Any of that is in the perinatal realm of consciousness that is good material to be brought up using the breath work. This last realm is something that I particularly love, and I went there in my first session. It got my attention. The transpersonal, which means beyond the personal, is anything that can happen in, are you good with the term archetype? You know what an archetype is? So if somebody was to experience that they had a talk with their guides or their angels or their dead mother, or maybe encounters with the devil, or encounters with, for me, when I first breathed, it was I turned into like a panther, going through the jungles of South America, and then a boa constrictor came, and I was doing this life and death struggle with a boa constrictor on the mat, being a panther in the jungle, like, what the hell is this? And what it was I was working out aggression that came from having been doing construction work, making a house from the ground up in redstone for a year. I had lost my femininity, and I had sacrificed a lot of my sensitivity and that sort of thing to be a construction worker, and I was overwhelmed and overloaded and frankly pissed. And just on the breathwork mat, I was able to say, yeah! I mean, the poor guy that was working with me is like, what is going on? But, I had never done this before, and it really got my attention. It's like, this is some powerful stuff. Now, not everybody goes there. I had had a lot of other experiences working things out of my psyche in different programs. So I was just ripe for that sort of thing. But it's one thing that can happen. It could be in one session that you have all those things happen. You go through some of your history, your current history, or some of your family history, and then you might pop into some experiences that we can interpret as like, oh, well, that's actually something about your birth. You might not recognize it, but it can be symbolic. And then you might have something archetypal. Like, oh, well, when I was born and this, magical being came and lifted me out and, told me that I was going to have a wonderful life, something like that. You could have all those things intermixed in a single session. So it kind of depends on what kind of inner work you've done with yourself in preparation. So let's talk about the biographical. That's anything that has happened to you. All your injuries, all your accidents, the way that you were born, and if it was just way too much to experience, it gets put down into your subconscious or your unconscious. We just can't deal with it. So some people have had traumas of what was omitted, what was not provided for them as children. So they can, become very needy or very dependent, and express all of that too, and get some of their needs met too on the breathwork mat or with their sitter. Children that have been abandoned at birth or adopted a lot of times have these kind of, I wasn't suckled, or I wasn't born right, or whatever. And then there are things that happened to us. So even when babies are pulled out and they're spanked, it's like, well, what's that about? Well, it's to get the plug of mucus out, but that's the first kind of insult. So we've all gone through things that have been committed to us, and our little, inner child feels like, that wasn't supposed to happen to me. So you could go back to your inner child and really grieve for what happened, with mom or dad or whatever. The relationship of a sitter and a breather can be very healing, to have somebody there for you when you're feeling like you've been abandoned or misunderstood. Now, I talked actually kind of a lot about the perinatal experiences. So I'm going to show you some pictures about some samples of that, the perinatal experience, and then he calls these matrices. So a birth matrix is those breathwork, those experiences I was talking about, the biographical, the perinatal, and the transpersonal. But then there are also stages of birth. So I don't have much time left, but I'm going to go through this and know that there will be available to you. Thank you to Megan. There'll be a transcript of basically this whole thing so that you can go back and look at it again. But we're going to go through what are these birth matrices, because it gives a map of what you could possibly experience, and then it gives you a reference point of Why are these things happening in my life that way? And a lot of them can be traced back to one of the stages of birth. So, the process of being born, from being wherever you were in spirit realm and going through like being a little, sperm and ovum and, being a embryo and then becoming a fetus and then getting bigger and ultimately coming through the womb, it's a major life change. You literally go from one way of being, which is the interuterine experience, which is kind of like a bliss realm because you're floating in the amniotic fluid and everything's taken care of and you and mom are one and everything is great until what happens? So this is what he calls the first matrix. It's about the first 3 months. Free floating in the womb. And, let's face it, a lot of us want to go back there. That's what waterbeds are about, or hammocks, or, skydiving, or floating in isolation tanks. We want to go back to this kind of a place because we remember it as being like a bliss realm. But then the second matrix, when the child gets to the point where it's coming up against the uterine walls, it gets into a place of confinement. It's like, oh, I can't just move anywhere I want, and the space is getting kind of crowded here, and, this is not feeling so good anymore. What's going on? So when the contractions of the uterus start, you've got this child that has used up all of its space, used up a lot of its nutrients, knows that it has to go somewhere because there's being these pressures of the contractions of the uterine wall, but there's no place to go because the cervix has not opened. So you get this situation where if it's head first, the head is getting pushed against the cervix, but there's no opening. So think about this in your life. When have you come up against a place where you've outgrown the context that you were in, whether it was a job or a relationship or school or family or whatever, but you can't figure out what the next step is? You know that you have to move. You know something's got to give and something's got to change, but you can't figure out the way out. So that is a reliving or a re-experiencing of that second birth matrix. It's a no exit experience. And, until something opens, you think it's never going to change. And I'm going to say this here, that I believe that a lot of the suicides that we're experiencing now is people who come up against circumstances in their life where they can't go any further on the path that they're going, and they don't find another way forward. They don't have a way forward, and they're afraid that they're going to die in the process. So, when we get to places like that in our lives, and I'm going to say that our psyche has a way of representing situations in our life that are trying to help us to work out those stages of birth. So you've probably all gone through this, where you can't go any farther where you live and you've got to move and you don't know where you're going to go. That's just... So then we go into the third matrix. So here, you really have to be born. You can't continue to live in the womb because there's no exit and you've used up all your resources. In your life, it would be coming up against something where you've been evicted or you're divorced or whatever. You've got to make a change. You've got to get out of this situation. Something's got to open up to the next place for you. The fourth matrix is actually when the cervix does open, the contractions push the baby through the birth canal, and there's terrible compressive forces on the cranial bones. Sometimes, our heads don't even come back to normal afterwards. But the process of being born itself is traumatic. There's just no way of getting around it. Being pushed through that small space with those tremendous forces and having your head crunched and, all the things that happen. It can get very graphic, but I'm not going to go into all that. But just know that the process of going through that canal and coming out the other side, every one of us has gone through a certain amount of birth trauma. That's why babies cry so much when they're first born. They're trying to work out the trauma. And a lot of relationships between mothers and children get very convoluted around that too, based on the consciousness of the child going through that experience and going, "Mother, what are you doing to me? Are you trying to kill me? This is a life and death struggle." So it can be the basis of a lot of relationship problems. So this is not figuratively, this is literally. We have all gone through a death and a rebirth. Everybody who's sitting in this room has died to one aspect of the way that they were, and were reborn through a tunnel, so to speak, and came into the light and came into a different kind of a life in this body, independent of mother, breathing on our own, growing and having our own life. So when it comes to death and rebirth, on the other end of, looking at death, you can say, well, I know that I had the experience of being near death at one point and surrendering to the process, and somehow going through that tube or that tunnel, the light opened up and I came into another life. So if you want to extrapolate that into spirituality, you could make a case for the ongoingness of life, that life is born, goes through cycles, transcends, goes through another cycle. It's at 7 o'clock now, so I'm kind of at the end of my thing here, but I just did want to say something about addiction. One of the reasons that people get addicted is because their life experiences they want something more numinous, or they want to sedate themselves so they don't have to feel the pain of the circumstances in their life, and so they go to a chemical, that alters their awareness for a while. But it doesn't sustain. So they get addicted to the chemical process of getting into that state of consciousness, and the chemical takes on its own life, and then you become addicted to the chemical. What you're really looking for is that state of numinousness, of freedom. So in the breathwork situation, sometimes we'll have symbolic experiences, and it can look something like this. This is the phoenix rising out of the ashes, a death rebirth experience. This is transpersonal, if you were to see something like this. So the major life changes that we've all gone through, everybody has moved at some point, right? Everybody. So you've gone from one place through a tough place into something else. We all know this. And we all know that at some place there's some kind of new life on the other side. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for a more expanded, a more free, a more open, a more loving, a more connected life. So all these transpersonal experiences are ways, after we've sort of processed our biography, after we've processed our birth, and then we can start to explore these other realms. That could be, heavenly realms. It could be other dimensions. It could be other life forms. It could be other times. It could be past lives. It could be future lives. It could be interplanetary travel. It could be anything. And Stan Grof, at this point, that's primarily what he's doing, is he's traveling through states of consciousness. And that's kind of my favorite thing to do, too. Oh, I want to say just one thing about coax. A system of coordinated experiences is when this happens, but it's kind of like, well, but something like that happened to me earlier, and something like that happened, at this time, and you can take it all the way back, often to birth. So this is just a graphic example of somebody who maybe was born with the cord wrapped around their neck, and then in the outer experience, somehow they attract, some kind of a partner that strangles them, or like the anaconda around me. So we tend to attract things that give us an opportunity to go back and clear whatever that initial program was. System of coordinated experiences. So in terms of sensitivity, things can happen to your physical body. You can get really hot, you can get cold, you can tremble, you could shake, you could scream, sweat, just about anything could happen, and it's all okay. You could feel like you're just going to sleep. Nobody sleeps through that kind of music, I assure you. But you can go into a state of consciousness where you're not processing things and it's just occurring below your level of consciousness. So, what kinds of things could happen? You just put yourself in this prototype. If you were here, any of these things could happen, and more. This is what we want to have happen, that we're just reborn as blissful babies with everything taken care of, and we know that everything is going to be fine, and that we were successful at being born, and we can look forward to a really nice life. Some of the reasons people would not want to be born, would not want to go through rebirthing, if you've got glaucoma, because the increased breathing puts pressure behind your eyes. If you're pregnant, you don't want to relive a birth while you're pregnant yourself. If you're too paranoid or you're too unstable mentally and emotionally, you don't want to go through this because it can change reality to the point where you kind of get destabilized. Of course, we didn't do this when COVID was happening because we're not going to share breath molecules. If you've got cardiovascular disease, a long time of rapid breathing could overtax your heart. If you've had a recent surgery or something, if you get real activated and you're thrashing around, you could potentially hurt yourself. So we do medical intake forms. We check for contraindications. We don't let anybody breathe unless it's going to be safe. These are just some of the things that have happened to people. Okay, I think I'm just going to stop there. I do have references if anybody's interested in what my resources were, or, well, let me just say, is anybody interested in having a breathing experience yourself? If there was a breathwork experience available? Okay, so I put, there are some workshops coming up here. One of them's on Zoom. GTT is Grof Transpersonal Training. This one's on Zoom, so anybody could do it. The next one is in Connecticut, and that's like 2 days of breathing. There is one coming up in Colorado, Loveland, in July. And locally, there are some people that are doing something called neo-shamanic breathwork. It's not exactly holotropic, but it's a close relative. So they're doing basically the same thing. A person that was trained by Grof that's using just a little different slant on it. So that's going to be available in Carbondale in April, and another one in June. So I believe everybody who signed in is on a list that I can access. If you want any of this information from me, how to access a workshop, copies of the slide. Even myself, I do private breath work. I don't set up workshops anymore, but I will sit with people one-on-one. In fact, I'm going to do one next week. So that's a whole different experience. I've got some cards out there. You're welcome to contact me. I'd love to hear from you. And I'm going to wrap this up just for time's sake. So thank you all so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much. We have some time for some Q&A. We will also send out a PDF of the handout to everybody who attended on the email list.
I'm going to have a seat if that's okay.
Of course. Just as a quick reminder for Q&A, please hold the mic close to your mouth and speak directly into it. And we will take as many as we can here. And please stand if you are able.
I just have a quick question because all of these examples were about vaginal deliveries. And my son actually not only did ayahuasca, but he also did some breathwork thing on his own where he called me asking me all these questions, and it was like spot on.
I'm not understanding everything. Speak a little bit slower.
What about a cesarean, basically, is the end result of the question. Because my son did all these things, and he asked me all these questions because he, on his own, did some breathing or something and got into this whole like pre-birth thing. And he said he was choking and he wanted to know. And I kind of had an emergency C-section because his heart rate on a routine appointment was like not there. And so most everything you explained for most people is, pushing against the cervix, all these other things. What if, actually my daughter is getting a scheduled C-section tomorrow because
okay, so the question
is, how does that affect the person?
So you're talking
going
about
through the,
emergency
being born.
C-section?
Or, just being born, not vaginally.
Right. Good question. Thank you. So when it comes to a cesarean section, they've still gone through all of the stages right up to the point of the last stage where you're being pushed through the birth canal. But if it comes to unless it's just elective, for the mother's health, they go through everything except the last stage of pushing through. So an interesting thing happens psychologically. One is that magically something opens up and they're lifted out of distress. That's a good thing. It's hard on the mother, but it's good that they didn't have to go through that. Been a certain amount of experiences of the compression and maybe the beginning of labor, but not that. But what tends to happen psychologically, and you can check this out, is there's something about going through that strenuous thing and coming out successful. It's like, I did it. And my Rolfing teacher even said it has something to do with the crown of the head and the intention toward verticality, that there's something growth producing in going through that and knowing that you can come out. And that people who have had cesarean deliveries, and this is no judgment or anything, but there tends to be an idea of like, when it gets really tough, something's going to come and rescue me out of this. Something's going to save me, and I don't really have to go through that. So I don't know if that's your situation, but that's what we've noticed psychologically with cesareans.
We have a question back here.
So what happened when somebody had a traumatic experience while in the womb, like a fetus, and now is remembering all that trauma, maybe domestic violence with mom? So what happened in that instance when he was not even aware that had happened, and now he's faced with that experience? I mean, does it always turn up beneficial for this person, or remembering that trauma is actually a good idea, that you're exposed to that?
The beneficial thing about going through something like that, as difficult as it is is that it gets brought up to a place of consciousness where you can actually look at it, be with what is, re-experience it in a safe setting where somebody's holding a container, and let you actually go through the whole thing without stuffing it back down into your subconscious and having it be acted out some other way. So I'm not going to say that it's fun or that it's easy, but it's beneficial in the long run, because if we're really going to be whole and healed in the body, mind, spirit, emotional realm, we can't be carrying around all this suppressed trauma that has not been remembered. So what we're doing in the breathwork situation is setting a container where it actually is safe enough to look at those things and have it come up and have it be accepted and played out and then gone. So when a person's ready for that, there are ways to do it.
Question is over here.
All right, there's a lot of little short ones, questions. So is the person that's on the floor breathing, is it just all in their mind, all these memories, or are they actually speaking them where the sitter can hear what's going on? That's one.
We don't use words because that tends to put you back up into your intellect and your logic. And so we're going more into, I would say, right brain, associative. So we can verbalize, but it would more like being emotional expression, not so much talking about it. So when you say mind, the mind is much more than just the brain. You know, mind can encompass all of the dimensions and the realms. And the information definitely comes from the memories that are stored in the brain cells. It's just that in non-ordinary states, it tends to get processed differently. It's not like linear and logically and speaking. It might present more like in pictures and feelings and that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Is there someone that's at the end can tell us what the symbolism is about everything? So we have to remember what we...
No, thank you. Thank you for that. I didn't get that far. So the way that we do what's called integration, so that all this stuff isn't just kind of like, whoa, what was that about? After the breathwork session, especially on a day long, where it's like, you know, a session in the morning and a session in the afternoon, and then there's time, we give people some nourishment, and then we have an integration period. So it's a group where we give people drawing materials. So this is really a nice, one of the things that I like best about this is you're given a piece of paper with a circle around it, and you're given crayons or pastels or something like that, and you're encouraged to make a symbolic drawing of what happened within a mandala, because it's kind of like a womb thing or a circle or a sphere. So whatever you can remember that came, because it's just fresh in your mind. It's like, oh, I went on this adventure and I saw this, and then it seemed like these things happened. Oh my gosh, and then it changed and there was this. So you could have something almost like cartoons of a whole bunch of things that could happen. Or you could have something that happened that's just like, whoa, there's just like one thing that happened, and you might just draw it as some colors. It doesn't have to be artistic, but that's the way to get the interior experience into outer expression, so that you've got a reference point, your own little map to look at. And then, after everybody has drawn their mandalas, we sit around and we share the mandalas. And so I was talking about connection. That's a way to feel connected with other people. It's like, wow, that person just, experienced being in a spaceship. Well, I experienced being in a spaceship too, except mine was like a steam line cruise, something like that. And this person will, like I had this happen in my childhood. It's like, oh my gosh, I had that same thing happen. So you find that there's connections of the people in the room because you're in a group consciousness. So that's the way that we integrate things, is having mandalas. And I personally, from every session that I've done, And sometimes even when I'm a sitter, I will draw one of those maps of consciousness, and I've got a rolled up stack that's about like that. So I can set it out in a room and go, oh, well, that was, July of 1989, and that's what I was going through. It's like, oh, I remember that, and it's just clear as day. Oh, well, that was October 1992. Oh my gosh, I remember I was going through that. And you can actually map your evolution of where you were in consciousness based on that map that you made of your own interior experience. Oh, so the facilitator is going to help you to interpret it. If you don't understand, it's like, why did I see that symbol? Well, we're all trained in symbolism, Jungian psychology and symbols and cross-cultural anthropology. That's part of our training, is for us to know all the varieties of things that could show up in somebody's drawing or their experience. It's all part of a workshop. Yeah. Yep.
Back here.
So I'm a therapist in Vail, and one of my personal practices is doing breath work. And with my mentor, she is trained with Leonard Orr, and so that's more of the conscious breathing. And I was curious, how I know there's some crossover there between the rebirthing breath work and the holotropic breath work. So I was just curious on your thoughts on that. I have done experience in both, but I'm just more on the rebirthing breath work now, and I just find it's an unbelievable practice. I'm always amazed that what can happen without use of psychedelics and just by following the breath. And the second part of the question is, in terms of working on ancestral trauma, I found that in breath work, I feel like sometimes that's what I've noticed. What comes up is trauma that feels like it's beyond my lifetime. That's possibly being carried down through, the generations. So one was on Leonard Orr, and the second question's on ancestral trauma.
Thank you. I did rebirthing before I ever heard of holotropic breathwork. So my experience of that is really geared towards having an actual rebirth. And my last session was in a hot tub. I breathed in a whole bunch of water, and it was not a good experience. But that's what that is geared for. But the breath itself, elicits non-ordinary states. So however you use the breath, something's going to happen. The rebirthing doesn't use music, right? I think that there is a sitter, usually, with you, a facilitator. So, it's beautiful work. It's just that, personally, I prefer the holotropic because I love the music, and I love the drawing, and I love all the acting out, and I love to be able to travel in those other dimensions and that are beyond my birth. Second question has to do with sexual trauma. Oh, I'm sorry. And that it could be intergenerational.
That sometimes what I have personally noticed is things have come up that seem beyond my lifetime. So it seems like stuff that's been carried down through my Jewish heritage. So it feels very ancestral to me.
I see. Absolutely valid. So that would be part of what I would put in the transpersonal band of consciousness, because it's beyond your biographical information. But now I'm going to go spiritual here for a minute. A soul has the memory of everything that has ever happened to you in this life and for all times. And I believe that the soul is eternal, and bodies incarnate in different packages. The soul has the continuous memory, and not only the memory of what you have gone through, but the experience of what your ancestors gave to you genetically. So it's all in there. It's in your genes, it's in your ancestry, it's in your soul memory. And when you enter in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, you have access to that. And a lot of people are doing intergenerational healing, from my mother, and healing from my grandmother, and healing from, the Holocaust, or healing, the original fall of man. There's no end to where we can go with this if you have the time and the space and the interest. And I think it's all beneficial. Good work.
Any further questions? We have time for maybe 2 more.
How about that side of the room?
We'll hit one here and then go to that side of the room.
So recently I hosted a holotropic with someone who was trained locally with Stanislav Grof, and we tried using music on headphones. I think one thing that we learned was that it might be better if it's in, like, the vibration of the music is there. I didn't know if you had any experience and how that can impact the process.
Personally, I prefer to have the room filled with the vibration. It's more interesting for me as a sitter and a facilitator, but you do get that vibration. And the headphones, you could knock them off, and you get the music for sure. And I don't know that you would have the same freedom. For me, my Kundalini starts going and my head's all over the place, and I would probably knock them off. But, if you're in a place like a condo and you can't play big music and you have to use headphones, it's valid. To the same music? Oh, yeah, well, right. Well, I tend to agree with the latter.
Over here.
Just quick question. So through your own breathing work and then being a sitter for other people, is that better? What have there been any negatives that have come out of this work?
Any negatives to come out of it? I've experienced one, you might call it negative, I suppose. I was in kind of like the last graduation module of training in Joshua Tree with Stan Grof and Jack Cornfield. We probably had, I'm going to say 300 people in there, which means 150 people are on the floor breathing at one time, and it switches. Of all those people, one woman had a cerebral hemorrhage and had to be taken to the hospital. And she was an older woman, but she had this insistence with her friend, I need to be in that breath work. I just absolutely need to, come with me. So the two of them went together, and she had her experience, and that happened physically. So she was in the hospital, and Stan and Jack Cornfield were closely working with the doctors. The doctors said, you did not cause this. That weakness, in the blood vessels in her brain could have been pre-existing all the way for her whole life. And it could have gone at any time. So don't feel like the breath work caused that. Her inner healer put her in a situation where she had a safe enough container to have whatever experience she had, with her friend there and being very well held by expert consciousness facilitators, and she made her transition. So is that bad? Is that good? I don't know. But I've seen hundreds, if not thousands, of breathwork sessions, and that's the only one that I would say, that there was an ab reaction. Things happen to people all the time.
On behalf of all of us at the Vail Symposium, I mean it when I say it, thank you for choosing to spend your evening with us here in Dr. Dia Lynn.